The risk of developing type 2 diabetes is massively elevated in people carrying extra weight. In fact, the risk of someone who is very obese compared to someone who's lean is not 10% higher, not 50% or even 100% higher, but almost 100-fold higher. One major reason for this link is that having too much body fat tends to make people insulin resistant. But then there are some normal weight people who are insulin resistant, while some very obese people are quite insulin sensitive and never develop diabetes. How does that make sense if carrying extra weight is so strongly linked to diabetes? In this video, I will go over the science of what type of extra body fat is linked to insulin resistance and explain a model called the personal fat threshold hypothesis that I believe is absolutely essential to understanding insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. And I'll close by sharing how you can find out whether you may have crossed your personal fat threshold. Welcome to Nourished by Science on YouTube. My name is Mario, and on this channel we are talking about all things nutrition as it relates to the prevention of chronic disease. In this video we will continue our discussion of blood sugar regulation and type 2 diabetes, and specifically discuss excess body fat as one of the major causes of insulin resistance. If we look at observational studies, we see that there is a very strong association between the body mass index, or BMI, and the risk of developing type 2 diabetes. In this cohort here, for example, more than 114,000 nurses were followed for 14 years. At baseline, none of them had diabetes, and if we compare the risk of developing type 2 diabetes during the 14 years of follow-up by these BMI categories here on the x-axis, we see that the risk increases with every increase in adiposity. And here in the highest BMI category, for those who had a baseline BMI of 35 or higher, we see that their risk of developing diabetes was 93-fold higher than that of those in the lowest BMI category. Not 93% higher, but 93-fold higher. And that is even though we should acknowledge that BMI is not a perfect measure of body fat mass, as we'll discuss later in this video. We also need to acknowledge that an association in an observational study does not prove that having more body fat mass causes type 2 diabetes. But seeing such a strong association and seeing it consistently across numerous studies, as is the case for this relationship here, does provide a higher level of confidence that a cause and effect relationship may be underlying the observed association. What we would like to know, though, is what it is about carrying extra body weight, and particularly fat mass, that so dramatically raises our risk of developing type 2 diabetes. As I discussed in more detail in my video about the regulation of blood sugar, diabetes is a disease in which the body loses its ability to keep blood sugar levels in the normal range. How good our glucose tolerance is depends on three factors: insulin sensitivity, the ability of our pancreatic beta cells to produce insulin, which we often call beta cell function, and insulin-independent glucose disposal, of which glucose effectiveness and exercise-induced uptake of glucose into muscle cells are probably the two most important ones. In general, as someone gains weight, we do tend to see worsening in beta cell function and glucose effectiveness as well. But the most profound shift that we also have the most evidence for is that weight gain is very commonly associated with an increase in insulin resistance. My objective with this video is to discuss that link between body weight and insulin resistance and what actually happens inside the body when we gain weight that can make us insulin resistant. In general, I will convey ideas here in this video rather than discuss the many hundreds of scientific publications these ideas are based on. But as always, you can find a more detailed discussion of the science along with all references on the blog post associated with this video. So let's start by looking at how weight gain is associated with an increase in insulin resistance. Let's say we had a group of men and we wanted to look at the relationship between BMI here on the x-axis and insulin resistance on the y-axis. We would get a cloud like this here. At normal body weight with a BMI between 20 and 25, most people would have fairly good to very good insulin sensitivity, or expressed the other way around, low insulin resistance. Note that there is some variability here though, so even at the exact same low BMI, some people are more insulin resistant than others. As BMI now increases, so does insulin resistance, at least on average. Among obese people, those with a BMI greater than 30, most are at least somewhat insulin resistant, and some are very insulin resistant. Note again, however, how some people remain pretty insulin sensitive, even with a BMI in the obese category. And that brings us to the first important point I'd like to make, and that is that BMI has one major limitation. Remember that we calculate BMI as the body weight in kilograms divided by the height in meters squared. So this is a measure of weight in relation to height. However, it tells us little about why body weight is elevated in any given individual. This person here in orange, for example, is a very lean bodybuilder who is heavy relative to his height simply because he carries a lot of muscle mass. At the same time, this man here in green appears to be overweight by BMI, but he has very little muscle mass and a high body fat percentage, so that's why he is pretty insulin resistant for this BMI level. So therefore, a better measure to look at would be body fat percentage. So let's change the x-axis from BMI to body fat percentage and see how the position of our two gentlemen on the graph change. Now, our bodybuilder in orange, who has a high BMI but a low body fat percentage, has moved quite a bit to the left, and now he is no longer an outlier. In fact, we would predict good insulin sensitivity in someone with such a low body fat percentage. And our under-muscled overweight man has now shifted to the right because even though his BMI was not all that high, he has a high body fat percentage, and that now is very much in line with the high level of insulin resistance he has. So what I'm hoping you can appreciate is that body fat percentage is a bit more strongly associated with insulin resistance than BMI. So again, in general, people who are lean with a low body fat percentage usually have low insulin resistance. And people with higher body fat percentage, as is common in those with overweight or obesity, tend to be more insulin resistant. And so maybe not unexpectedly, someone who is lean and insulin sensitive tends to become more insulin resistant if they gain weight, and losing weight often reduces insulin resistance. A few additional important points. First, I mentioned that this graph is based on men. The relationship is very similar for women. The reason to talk about men and women separately is that women have a higher body fat percentage at the same level of BMI, and so it's important to look at these graphs separately. Second, you can see that there is still a wide spread in insulin resistance at any given level of body fat percentage. One potential reason for this is that there are many other reasons that have nothing to do with body fat that can cause insulin resistance. As we will discuss in more detail in a later video, there are certain medical conditions or medications, for example, that can cause insulin resistance. And so this person here, or that one, may well be insulin resistant because of a medication they are taking at the moment, or because they have been chronically sleep deprived or stressed. And third, still, even if we created this graph from a population in which we had excluded anyone who is insulin resistant because of another illness, medication intake, chronic stress, etc., we would still have variability at any given level of body fat percentage. And the reason for this is that people store fat in different places, and it matters quite a lot for insulin sensitivity where the extra fat is stored. Let me explain. To understand this, we need to take a look at how fat can safely be stored in the body. Let's consider this gentleman here in red, Mark. In his 20s, Mark is a very lean and athletic young man, but then he gets injured, starts a busy career with lots of travel, and has a couple of kids. And we all know how it goes. Not enough time for sleep, exercising regularly, or preparing meals. He has many meals on the road in fast food restaurants, and over the next 20 years, he gains 40 pounds. But he remains pretty insulin sensitive. Well, in his case, he gained 40 pounds of body fat, but his body was able to store it away safely in his subcutaneous fat tissue. That's the fat tissue right under the skin, all over the body. So we would expect that now there is a bit more fat stored in the subcutaneous fat depots, in his hands, his arms, his face, really anywhere, but particularly in the subcutaneous fat depots on the outside of his belly and his thighs. If you took an MRI scan right through the middle of his belly, let's say around the area of the belly button, this here is what this may look like. So the belly button would be here. This here is the spine, and these here in dark gray are the large muscles of the back. On the side here and up front are also muscles. And in dark here in the abdominal cavity, these are Mark's inner organs. In white, we see his fat tissues. The fat on the outside, just under his skin, that's what we call the subcutaneous fat. The fat deep within his belly, surrounding the inner organs, that's what we call intra-abdominal or visceral fat. And what we can see readily is that Mark has most of his belly fat stored on the outside. He has a lot of subcutaneous fat and very little visceral fat. And actually, most of his body fat cannot be seen here in this image because it isn't even stored around his belly, but in the subcutaneous fat tissues of his thighs, his legs, his arms, his shoulders, and so forth. Now, if Mark could gain this much body fat and barely become any more insulin resistant, why is body fat mass then so strongly associated with insulin resistance? Well, let's take a look at the type of body fat that does trigger insulin resistance. For these purposes, let's look at another example. Jim, here in blue. Like Mark, he was very lean and athletic in his 20s. And like Mark, he also gained 40 pounds of fat mass over the next 20 years of his life. So in their 40s, Jim and Mark have exactly the same body fat percentage. But while Mark is still pretty insulin sensitive, Jim is now very insulin resistant. What is going on here? Well, let's again take a look at an MRI image across Jim's belly. Jim also has a lot of fat stored in his subcutaneous fat tissue, but he also has way more fat stored in his visceral fat depots around his inner organs. Actually, if we quantified it, he has 3.5 times as much as Mark, even though both have the same total body fat percentage. What this means is that Jim overall has a lower percentage of fat stored in the subcutaneous fat depots around his body. His thighs, for example, may still look pretty lean. These differences in how these two men store fat would be apparent already from the outside. Mark would have a body shape more like a pear because he has stored a lot of his excess fat in the subcutaneous fat tissue in the lower part of his body, particularly his buttocks and thighs. Jim, by contrast, would have a shape more similar to an apple because he stores most of his excess fat in his belly and particularly in the visceral fat depots deep inside of his belly. Now, why does storing fat in the visceral fat depots trigger insulin resistance while storing it in the subcutaneous fat depots does not? The picture that is emerging, with lots of support from different lines of evidence from experiments done in both animals and humans, suggests that it isn't really the visceral fat that causes insulin resistance, at least not by itself. Instead, what it looks like is that having a lot of visceral fat indicates that the subcutaneous fat tissue is filled to capacity and can no longer store more fat. And once fat can no longer be safely stored in our subcutaneous fat depots, a whole host of things change that contribute to insulin resistance. What is that supposed to mean now? The subcutaneous fat tissue is filled to capacity and can no longer store more fat. Well, let me share the basics of how fat tissue works and how that is linked to what has now become known as the personal fat threshold hypothesis. Let's assume we had a very good microscope and took a look at the subcutaneous fat tissue in this little red box here and observed the changes in someone like Jim as he is gaining 40 pounds of fat mass over 20 years. So we start this journey with Jim when he's 25 years old. He has a fairly low body fat percentage and is very insulin sensitive. If we look at his subcutaneous fat tissue at this time, it consists of many fat cells that are mostly small. Now, when I say small, that's actually incorrect. Fat cells, or adipocytes, are some of the largest cells in the human body. So when I say small, these are still manyfold larger than most other cell types. But as far as fat cells go, these here in young Jim are small. What you see is that these fat cells are largely filled by a fat droplet. These are triglycerides, the same type of fat that you'll find in butter or olive oil. That's the long-term storage form of fat and energy in the human body. Fat tissue does consist of many other cell types as well. I don't want to go into too much unnecessary detail here, but let me emphasize two types. One are endothelial cells that make up the small blood vessels that provide nutrients and oxygen to the fat cells. I have drawn these here in red. Another, in blue, are cells called pre-adipocytes. As I said earlier, fat cells are also called adipocytes. So pre-adipocytes, you can imagine, are like fat cells in waiting. They're not ready to store fat yet, but they will become mature fat cells should they be called upon. For now, they're just hanging out. If we were able to look at this during a typical day of Jim's life, we would see that in the fasting state, say when he's sleeping, the fat cells release a small trickle of the fat that they have stored. What they release are individual fatty acids that then float through the blood to provide tissues all over the body with energy. To be able to look at the flow of nutrients in the tissue, let's remove the red blood cells from this animation. What you would then see is that when Jim is in a fasting state, some of the fat stored in his fat cells is released as free fatty acids. These move with the blood to tissues all over the body to provide fuel. This changes when Jim eats a meal. After each meal, his blood levels of glucose, fatty acids, and insulin are high, and then the flow of nutrients changes. Under the influence of the elevated insulin, insulin being the little red triangle here, the fat cell changes in three key ways. For one, it stops the release of fatty acids by the cell. That makes sense, right? Insulin is a signal that food was just consumed, and that means nutrients are going to be available to tissues from that food. Because it's no longer necessary for fat cells to provide energy, insulin stops the breakdown and release of fat stored in the fat cells. Insulin also enables the cells to take up glucose as well as fatty acids from the blood. Glucose is then converted to fatty acids, and the fatty acids get stored as triglycerides. So keep this in mind. Insulin binding to the fat cell and the fat cell responding to it are crucial processes, not just in clearing glucose from the blood, but in enabling the fat cell to take up and store fat as well. This process, where the fat cell stores fat right after the meal and then releases it again while we're fasting, happens several times throughout the day. And if we eat as many calories as we're burning, the total amount of fat stored in the body stays about the same over time, with just a small fluctuation up and down throughout the day. However, this is not the case with Jim. He is actively gaining weight. See here, by this time, he is 38 years old now, and now his body fat percentage has increased quite a bit, which means that over these years, he needed to store more and more fat in his fat tissues. Now, what you can appreciate is that even though Jim gained quite a bit of weight, his insulin resistance didn't change all that much. That is because he was able to store the additional fat largely in his subcutaneous fat tissue, which expanded by recruiting new preadipocytes and making them into mature fat cells. In other words, the number of fat cells in his subcutaneous fat tissue increased, but the size of his fat cells did not increase. He now has more small fat cells. Let me show you how this works using our little cartoon. What we can imagine is that while Jim was actively gaining weight, more and more nutrients in the form of glucose and fatty acids were entering the subcutaneous fat tissue, and additional long-term storage space for these needed to be found. As I mentioned earlier, the subcutaneous fat tissue does contain preadipocytes, which I illustrated in blue here. In times of need, these can be activated, which enables the ability to take up glucose and fatty acids and store fat. They become very small fat cells. And then these can continue to take up glucose and fatty acids for a while as they grow to the size of the other fat cells in the tissue. So again, initially, as more fat needs to be stored, the number of fat cells increases in the subcutaneous fat tissue, but the size of the existing fat cells stays about the same. We call this increase in the number of cells hyperplasia. And usually, when the subcutaneous fat tissue is able to expand by hyperplasia, insulin sensitivity does not change much. So if we were to take another MRI scan here when Jim is 38, we would expect him to have more subcutaneous fat, but not much more visceral fat. But subcutaneous fat tissue cannot expand through hyperplasia forever, because the tissue is limited in the number of preadipocytes it can recruit. It does seem clear that older individuals have a more limited ability to recruit new preadipocytes. That is because with age, we seem to partially lose the stem cells that are needed to make new preadipocytes. There probably is also a genetic component to how much we can expand the subcutaneous fat tissue by hyperplasia. Anyways, there is a limit to how many more small fat cells we can recruit. That limit has been reached in Jim here by the time he's 38. Over the next few months, as his body fat percentage continues to increase, the subcutaneous fat cells start to increase in size. That is because his subcutaneous fat cannot recruit more new fat cells, so the existing ones need to store more. This process we now call hypertrophy. Jim now has more fat cells than when he was young, And all of these are now also gradually getting larger and larger. This has several negative consequences. For one, fat cells that get too big move further and further away from the blood vessels that provide nutrients and oxygen, at least some of them. I have tried to model this here, but I'm hoping you can imagine what this looks like in a three-dimensional tissue that is expanding. The expansion creates pockets of cells that lack enough oxygen, a condition we call hypoxia. Getting too large and not getting enough oxygen creates a state that threatens the very survival of individual cells, and actually some do die. As a result, you suddenly have globs of fat and cell debris lying around, and you don't need to be a cell biologist to understand that this is probably not a healthy thing. The second thing that happens is that fat cells that get too big and that lack oxygen call for help. A specific type of white blood cell called a monocyte is one of the first to respond usually, and these monocytes move from the blood into the fat tissue. In the tissue, the monocytes change to become specialized cells called macrophages that are ready for whatever task is at hand. These macrophages are seriously amazing kinds of cells. They get the message that the huge fat cells are overwhelmed, and they also see the globs of fat and tissue debris from the dead cells lying around. So they do a number of things. For one, they clean up the mess from the dead fat cells. They also help build new blood vessels to make sure that all cells within the expanded fat tissue receive enough nutrients and oxygen. And they secrete mediators of inflammation. And these mediators, we call them cytokines, come to the aid of the very large fat cells by making them insulin resistant. And that makes sense because imagine that these super big fat cells are so large that they can barely survive. By becoming insulin resistant, their growth is basically stopped. Because if now after a meal sugar and fatty acids come by along with insulin, insulin is no longer able to effectively shuttle sugar and fatty acids into the large fat cells. And insulin is also less able to inhibit the release of fatty acids by the fat cell that usually only occurs during fasting. As a result, the large fat cell continues to secrete fatty acids into the blood rather than taking up sugar and fatty acids from the blood. Locally and specifically for this huge fat cell, that is a win because it prevents the fat cell from dying. But as you can probably guess, it comes at a cost. For one, we now have insulin resistance in our subcutaneous fat tissue. And because subcutaneous fat tissue is one place that can remove sugar from the blood after a meal, this is not a good thing. It's basically like we had a team of different tissues working together to keep blood sugar in the normal range at all times. And by making the subcutaneous fat tissue insulin resistant, we're one player down. But the bigger issue is that the glucose and the fat from the blood now need to go elsewhere. And where do they go? They get stored in the visceral fat depots and also in muscle and inner organs such as the liver and the pancreas. And so as the fat content in the visceral depots increases and the fat content in liver and muscle increases, so does overall insulin resistance. One way to think about this is energy toxicity. The cells in liver and muscle and also the subcutaneous and visceral fat tissues, they are among the major cell types that take up glucose after meals. And now they're increasingly stuffed already with sugar and fat. And just like you are stuffed and unable to eat more once you've had a few pieces of cake, the liver cells and the muscle cells and the fat cells increasingly say, enough, and they reduce their sensitivity to insulin. And less sensitivity to insulin is what we call insulin resistance. So I mentioned earlier the term personal fat threshold. What does that mean? The personal fat threshold is the amount of fat that can safely be stored in small fat cells within the subcutaneous fat tissue. So for Jim, his personal fat threshold would be about here when he is around 38 years old. Because what we can see clearly is that beyond this point, even small amounts of additional fat that need to be stored trigger major increases in insulin resistance. That's strongly suggesting that from this point on, more and more of the additional fat needs to get stored in unsafe places. We call these unsafe places ectopic fat depots. Ectopic meaning untypical or not made for this purpose. Traditionally, we call fat stored in liver, muscle, and pancreas ectopic because these are not fat storage tissues. But I and some of my colleagues would also call visceral fat depots ectopic because for optimal health, we really shouldn't be storing a lot of fat there. So at this point, when Jim is 45, he now is insulin resistant because he now has quite a lot of fat stored in his visceral fat depots. He has excess fat in his liver and muscle, and he has low-grade chronic inflammation in his tissues, but also measurable in his blood. We'll talk about this later in the video. Because it's such an important point, let's be clear again that how Jim's body has stored excess body fat is in direct contrast to Mark, our earlier example. Remember that Jim and Mark, at this time point here when these MRI scans were taken, are both in their 40s and they have an identical body fat percentage. But Mark is lucky in that he is able to store most of his body fat in his subcutaneous fat depots. He does not store much fat in his visceral depots or his liver and muscle, and because his subcutaneous fat isn't overwhelmed yet, he also doesn't suffer from low-grade chronic inflammation in his fat tissue. And as a result, he remains quite insulin sensitive, even though he has a fairly high body fat percentage. Now, don't forget that I've picked two extreme examples here. But even though they're extreme, they do illustrate nicely that an increase in body fat does not per se trigger an increase in insulin resistance, even though body fat percentage is associated with insulin resistance at the population level. That is because only certain types of body fat, namely that stored in visceral and ectopic depots, cause insulin resistance, while fat stored in subcutaneous depots does not. One way to think about the relationship between body fat percentage and insulin resistance is simply that as the body fat percentage increases, it becomes more and more likely that any given individual will cross their personal fat threshold and start accumulating fat in their visceral and ectopic depots. What is the evidence supporting the personal fat threshold hypothesis? Specifically, how do we know that this is what happens and that there couldn't be another explanation for why people with excess fat mass tend to be more insulin resistant? Well, in science, it's close to impossible to ever be 100% certain. There can always be other explanations, and as scientists, we should remain open to new ideas and new data. And in fact, there may well be additional factors that happen as we eat and gain weight that could contribute to insulin resistance. We'll talk about these additional factors in future videos. The model that I have outlined here simply is the one that, in my opinion and that of many of my colleagues, is the most consistent with the cumulative evidence. So let me share a few more pieces of evidence that support this model and that has made me fairly convinced that this personal fat threshold hypothesis holds a lot of value. The key piece of evidence supporting the personal fat threshold hypothesis is what we just discussed, that people with obesity who are insulin sensitive tend to have more fat stored in their subcutaneous fat depots. They tend to have less visceral fat, less fat in liver and muscle, and lower levels of inflammation. In contrast, those people who are most insulin resistant have much more fat stored in visceral depots. They tend to have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or NAFLD, which means excessive fat storage in the liver. They tend to have fat stored in their muscle tissue, and they tend to have high levels of inflammation markers in their tissues and in their blood. There's another line of research that strongly suggests that there is a special benefit to storing fat in subcutaneous fat depots and not in visceral fat depots, or even liver and muscle. And that is research on a medical condition called lipodystrophy. Lipodystrophy can be genetic or acquired, for example, in some people taking antiretroviral drugs for HIV infection. What they have in common is that in all cases, the subcutaneous fat tissue is more or less unable to recruit pre-adipocytes to store fat safely. And so these people often have very thin arms and legs with very little subcutaneous fat tissue. And most of their body fat is stored in visceral depots as well as in liver and muscle. And that kind of picture clinically often comes with more or less pronounced insulin resistance and often manifest type 2 diabetes. In mice that have been genetically changed to have lipodystrophy, we see the same thing. And then if some functional subcutaneous fat tissue is transplanted to them, the whole condition, including the insulin resistance, is to some degree reversible. Some investigations have also studied the effect of inhibiting the inflammation in fat tissue, liver, and muscle that comes from crossing the personal fat threshold. Generally, these studies show a modest improvement in insulin sensitivity, suggesting that inflammation plays a causal role in the development of insulin resistance with fat mass gain. The last major piece of evidence supporting the personal fat threshold hypothesis comes from weight loss studies. Whenever people lose weight, their insulin sensitivity tends to improve, but we see the greatest improvements in people in whom liver fat, muscle fat, and visceral fat drop the most. So again, that strongly supports the idea that storing fat in these depots contributes strongly to insulin resistance. Why is the personal fat threshold hypothesis relevant? Just to spell this out very clearly. Once someone gains body fat that can no longer be safely stored in small fat cells in subcutaneous fat tissue, that's when a lot of health risks manifest. For one, as we discussed here, storage of fat in visceral fat depots as well as liver and muscle is almost certainly a key contributor to insulin resistance and a major reason why people with high BMIs tend to have a massively elevated risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Storing a lot of fat in ectopic depots is bad for other reasons as well though. Let's look at the liver first. Storing a lot of fat in liver is called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease or NAFLD, and NAFLD is a risk factor for hepatic fibrosis and cirrhosis. And liver cirrhosis is a pretty bad condition in its own right. Then the heart. It's now recognized that storing excessive amounts of fat in one of the visceral fat depots, the epicardial fat depot, that is surrounding the heart, is a risk factor for coronary heart disease. That is probably particularly the case if chronic low-grade inflammation is present in the epicardial fat tissue. Similarly, a visceral fat tissue surrounding the gastrointestinal tract called the mesenteric fat is thought to play a role in cancers of the digestive system, particularly colon cancer. And lastly, we do know that expansion of visceral fat and inflammation in visceral fat is associated with a decreased kidney function. So all that said, we have very good reasons to try hard to stay below our personal fat threshold. I do think knowing about this hypothesis can be useful because it suggests that negative health consequences of weight gain do not scale in a linear fashion. Most of us can probably gain quite a few pounds before we cross the personal fat threshold. Not that I want to encourage weight gain, but it may be helpful to know that not every extra pound we gain throughout our life necessarily has negative health consequences. And even if we are overweight or obese, the existing data do suggest that major health benefits can result from losing just a few extra pounds if that weight comes right out of the liver and the visceral fat depots. Jim, from our earlier example, would just need to lose a few pounds of the extra fat mass and his insulin sensitivity would improve pretty dramatically. He wouldn't need to go back all the way to the body weight he had in his 20s. I'm sure many of you are wondering now, how do we know whether we have crossed our own personal fat threshold? The best way to find out is to have an abdominal MRI scan to directly measure the visceral fat mass and the fat in the liver. This is not routinely done in clinical care, but you could certainly pay for the scan yourself if you really need to know. Let me clarify that I don't think this is necessary for most people. So unless you have a few hundred or even $1,000 to spare, using some indirect measures will be the better choice. One option is to get an estimate of visceral fat mass from a DEXA scan. DEXA scans are commonly done to measure bone mineral density, but the software can usually also provide a pretty good measure of total body fat mass and an estimate of visceral fat, at least with newer DEXA scanner models. Liver fat can also be estimated by specific ultrasound methods. Another option is to consider your BMI together with a measure of insulin resistance, such as HOMA-IR, which I discussed in the last video, a measure of inflammation, such as CRP or C-reactive protein, and the fasting blood triglycerides. So if you have an elevated body mass index, elevated HOMA-IR, elevated CRP or C-reactive protein, and elevated fasting triglycerides, it is likely that your body has increased visceral and ectopic fat depots. For CRP, it is important to get the high sensitivity CRP test done, by the way. The normal one is not sensitive enough. If several of these biomarkers are elevated, and the more each is elevated, the more likely it is that you have passed your personal fat threshold and the more ectopic fat you probably have. Note that in most people who have excessive visceral and ectopic fat, most or all of these markers will be at least slightly elevated. So consistent elevation in at least 2 or 3 of these markers is what we're looking for, not a single elevated one. That is particularly important to remember because these markers could be elevated for reasons other than excessive visceral and ectopic fat. CRP, for example, is just a general marker of inflammation, and it could be massively elevated in someone who is acutely ill or who has just had major surgery. That's not what we're looking for here. Instead, what we're interested in is detecting the chronic low-grade inflammation in fat tissue or liver that results from these tissues being overwhelmed with nutrient excess. So it's important to get blood drawn for these tests in the fasting state and only if you're not acutely ill and haven't had surgery in the last month. Also, these cutoffs here are my estimates, obviously based on the scientific literature, but they are not firmly established clinical cutoffs. So please use these only to get a rough idea of how likely it is that you may have elevated visceral and ectopic fat. So please be careful with self-diagnosis and in all cases discuss this with your doctor. I personally do think these measures hold value in the absence of direct measurements, such as an MRI scan, and they could also be used to track progress if you are trying to lose ectopic and visceral fat. To summarize the personal fat threshold hypothesis, BMI and particularly body fat percentage are associated with insulin resistance. However, at any given level of adiposity, there is quite a bit of variability in insulin resistance. This is because not all body fat causes insulin resistance. In fact, storing fat safely in small fat cells in subcutaneous fat depots is somewhat protective against insulin resistance. Insulin resistance develops mostly after the personal fat threshold has been crossed. At that threshold, the person's subcutaneous fat tissue can no longer expand by recruiting new fat cells called hyperplasia, and instead expands by growth of existing fat cells called hypertrophy. Hypertrophy of fat cells leads to inflammation and insulin resistance in subcutaneous fat cells. Insulin resistance in subcutaneous fat cells reduces the ability of the body to store fat safely, and gradually more fat needs to be stored in ectopic locations such as the visceral fat depots surrounding the inner organs, muscle, liver and pancreas tissues. Excessive storage of fat in these depots also causes inflammation and insulin resistance in these tissues. The end result is whole body insulin resistance because all of the tissues that usually take up glucose after a meal, rich in carbohydrates, are already full to the brim with nutrients. In other words, the ability of these tissues to do their job and participate in normal blood sugar regulation is impaired because of what we may call energy toxicity. That's it for this video. I hope this was informative and interesting to all of you. If it was, I'd appreciate it if you could leave a like and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, you'd do me a huge favor if you could share the video with others who may be interested in evidence-based content about nutrition as it relates to the prevention of chronic disease. As always, you can find a more detailed blog post including all references on my website. And yes, I noticed that this is already a very long video and you may not feel like you need more detail. However, I feel strongly that it's important to be transparent about the scientific source material and also provide some background information on my reasoning. I therefore always provide these on the website. The link is always in the description box below each video. Thank you for watching. Take good care.